The 1997 Myst sequel Riven is one of my favorite games of all time, and I'm not someone who has any nostalgia for it, as my first time playing Riven was in 2020. Even playing the game so many years later, I was completely captivated by its world and atmosphere. Developer Cyan's unique flavor is an intense focus on world building, striving to create worlds that feel as real and believable as possible. Every part of Riven feels thought out and purposeful, all working cohesively in service of this goal. From the beautiful pre-rendered scenes, which are all filled with story details, to the excellent sound design, which provides ambience to environments and gives interactions a gritty, realistic feel. And most impressively, the puzzles, which are exceptionally well integrated into the world and story. No obstacle feels like it just gets in your way for the sake of it. Rather, these are solved by applying knowledge which is gained through natural interactions and exploration. Riven felt like a real place I visited, more so than any other game world I've experienced. For the time, Riven was a real technical achievement, not only with the quality of its pre-rendered graphics being a massive jump up from Myst, but also in how cleverly it integrated videos and animations into its scenes. Of course, with such limited technology and having to fit the game onto 5 CD-ROMs, it's rendered at a very low resolution by today's standards, and those FMVs have a lot of visible artifacts on modern displays. These issues, along with the relatively archaic point-and-click gameplay, make the Myst games a bit harder for new audiences to get into. As such, Cyan has since begun remaking them, starting with the original Myst and now with the release of Riven in 2024. Many fans, including myself, have long been excited at the prospect of a full real-time 3D realization of Riven, and now we've gotten just that. In many ways, this version is exactly what we'd hoped for. Unlike with the Myst remake, which dramatically overhauled the art direction from the original, Cyan has made the wise decision with Riven to maintain the original visual style in its recreation. Aesthetics have been updated with a meticulous attention to detail, and the results are stunning in most areas. That said, the developers have taken creative liberties elsewhere, making a lot of changes to the world design and puzzles, and these have more mixed results. Some changes are for the better, even addressing little problems with the original game here and there, but others come with complications. For existing fans, most of the additions and revisions will breathe new life into this familiar place, but along the way some important elements have been lost, which can result in a weakened experience for first-time players of the 2024 version. Since Riven 2024 is a remake, my focus in this review will be on evaluating it against the original game, and analyzing how it measures up to it in various aspects. With that in mind, there will be major spoilers for the entirety of both versions here, so if you haven't played either release of Riven, I would highly recommend doing so before watching any further. This is the type of game where learning and observation is really the bulk of the experience, so having everything explained in advance will severely hamper it. I recommend playing the original game if you can, but the 2024 version is also very good, so if you absolutely won't play the original, then you should at least play the remake before continuing.
Thank God you've returned. I need your help.
From the surface, cutscenes have received the most obvious downgrade from the 1997 game, as the new 3D character models don't adequately replace the live-action shots from before. It would be easy to ridicule some of these models, but I don't want to be too hard on them. After all, there's no way they could have used the original videos with how low-res they were, and for that matter, live-action characters wouldn't have worked well at all in a 3D environment. The still camera and low game resolution were a major part of what allowed them to blend in as well as they did. Abduction uses some live-action elements, but only in very limited places, like the imagers or just flat screens. The closest thing to seeing a character directly in that game was CW in his vault, but even with this filter between you, he still fails to blend in very well. All this is to say, 3D models had to be used, and considering realistic human characters are something even AAA developers with massive budgets still have trouble with today, you can hardly expect Cyan to do an amazing job at this with only a small fraction of the resources. This is a bit of a catch-22 with remaking Riven, since it went with a realistic aesthetic to begin with. You either sacrifice the original art style to go with a more stylized approach, or keep the original visual style at the expense of the characters. Considering the environments of Riven are much more prominent than its citizens, I think they made the right call. The characters look serviceable enough, so I won't dwell on them any further, but there are some other issues with the cutscenes worth mentioning. In the opening, Atris's dialogue has been re-recorded and even slightly rewritten. Whether intentional or not, the delivery here conveys different emotions from before. For example, when explaining what the trap book is, he originally gave off a sense of uneasiness about having to resort to this.
It appears to be a linking book.
back here to Dunny. But it's actually a one-man prison. You'll need it, I'm afraid, to capture Gan.
Whereas now, the attitude sounds more like a mission briefing and nothing more.
It appears to be a linking book back here to Dunny, but it's actually a one-person prison. It's the only way to capture Gan.
2024 Atris doesn't seem particularly bothered by the idea of having to imprison his father in a book.
Here.
Climbing around to the back of the prison is pretty cool, but the change in the way you actually get to this place isn't accounted for in Catherine's dialogue. She still asks how you got past Gen, but you don't need to encounter Gen to get here anymore, and it's very likely that you won't by this point. Her other comments about how Gen is watching you tend to make more sense in the context where you've been wandering around for a while before getting here. This still usually works, but you can get here before doing much of anything by using the dome on Temple Island, in which case this dialogue feels awkward. The scene when rescuing Catherine also has some weaknesses compared to the original. First of all, there's a huge shift in her delivery that reflects on her character completely differently between the two versions. Originally, her tone here was urgent but confident, with a little bit of amazement and relief at Gen's capture.
You captured Gen. But there's still his followers. I'm not sure what they'll do once they realize he's gone. I'll have to get the villagers to safety as soon as possible. You go back to the Temple Island and reopen the fissure. I know it's risky, but it's the only way to signal Atris. I'll try to make it back there as soon as I can, but don't wait for me. Don't forget, the portal combination's in my journal. Good luck.
Now she just sounds scared and overdramatic.
But they're still his followers. I'm not sure what they'll do once they realize he's gone. I have to get the villagers to safety as soon as possible. And you go back to where you first arrived and reopen the fissure. I know it's risky, but it's the only way to signal Atris.
It's my opinion that the original performance was far better, but even putting that aside, the way the scene plays out is really odd now. Catherine used to come into the elevator with you, which makes sense given the urgency of the situation. Now she just leaves you in the room for some reason. I mean, does she even know that you'll still be able to call the elevator back up? Seems like a dangerous assumption to make considering this is a prison.
I apologize for the cage.
Gen still has John Keston's fantastic vocal performance, but the new animations can't match the equally great physical performance from before. To reiterate, I do think the character models deserve some slack, but it is a shame that so much of the performance is lost here, especially his facial expressions, which changed when broaching certain topics.
It seems she's become some sort of religious savior to them. And as far as I can tell, she's come to believe this herself.
His movements were also much more natural, like the way he paces around, smokes his pipe, and the way he suspiciously looks through the book and then hesitates to use it. This whole performance came together to create one of the most memorable and well-executed cutscenes I can think of in any game. The remake has the surface-level parts intact, but the awkward animations and stiff facial expressions don't do the whole thing justice. They also removed one of Gen's lines for some reason.
I had to separate her from her people. I must admit, though, that my concerns were not entirely for her safety alone. The actions of Catherine and the moiety have put my own life at risk on numerous occasions. I had to separate her from her people. The actions of Catherine and the moiety have put my own life at risk on numerous occasions.
It doesn't make any sense to me why they would remove this. There are some other indications of Gen being more overtly evil in this version, so maybe this was part of an attempt to remove any semblance of subtlety to his character. Needless to say, I preferred how it was before. The opening unfortunately doesn't give a great first impression for the remake, but thankfully cutscenes only make up a small portion of the game overall. Once you're actually out and walking around, things are looking much better. The environments of Riven are incredibly well realized, and being freed from the shackles of the still screens of old is an amazing feeling that allows you to get pulled into this world even more. I can't overstate how refreshing this can be at times, as the low resolution and limited camera angles in the original often made it much harder to get a good look at things. The textures and modeling of the environments match the style of the original just about perfectly, and there's an increased sense of life with more animation than was possible in the old format. Pipes bob up and down as water waves in the ocean. Moths scatter as you run past. Trees and plants sway in the air. Fish swim around in the bay as bubbles rise and weeds wiggle. The world feels truly alive in the new engine. Some especially nice touches are the maglev you can see departing at the beginning, the submarine moving away when you first go to the village, and the wark swimming by on Survey Island. These complement other existing events that serve to give the feeling that this is a living place with other people and things happening independent of you. Soundscapes are still fantastic as well. Just about all the familiar sounds of Riven are kept in the remake. The creaking of wood, dripping of water, grinding of rusty metal, the flowing of steam, the buzzing of beetles and noises of unknown creatures as you walk through the jungle, the whirring and rattling of the maglev car while you ride through the wind, and of course, Robin Miller's otherworldly music cued in at various places. The atmosphere of these islands is recreated as well or even better than I'd hoped, and it's really something to behold. VR support is a great feature that can enhance this even more when it's working well. This review won't be focused on the VR experience, but I will say that it adds a lot to the game, and I'd recommend trying it if you have the equipment for it. Some differences in the environment can be seen the moment you step out of the cage, most notably the telescope, which looks a bit different and has some other devices next to it. There's some neat stuff here, but what I want to talk about is this panel. In terms of its puzzle function, this replaces the buttons on the hatch from before. Now, I'm not about to suggest that the point-and-click style was better than having free movement or anything, but this does actually highlight an advantage that it had. In the old style, every action is arbitrarily determined by the screen you're on and where you click. This can cause confusion about what actions are available at times, but on the other hand, allows for these situations where you're supposed to move in ways that are harder to map to a standard control scheme. Considering the 2024 version doesn't even have a crouch action, you'll never see anything low to the ground like this that needs to be interacted with. This becomes a bigger issue right around the corner with the locked gate. Previously, you just crawled under it, but since crawling isn't an action you can perform now, this has been changed. It's harder for me to believe that this hinge mechanism would just slide out like this with no signs of being broken or anything, so this feels less natural than before. Elsewhere, the wark gallows now has this mechanism that feels out of place compared to the rope from the original. Another example is the vent you had to climb through to get into Gen's lab, though I don't miss this one considering this switch to turn off the fan was in a pretty arbitrary location, and in exchange we got the fire marble mine, which adds a nice bit of world building. Using this machine to pull the telescope out is actually pretty cool as a new way of opening the fissure, so this change in itself isn't really an issue, but there is a separate and bigger problem with this control panel that I'll come back to when talking about the puzzles. It's also possible that VR support was a factor that played into these types of revisions. There's other evidence of this being a consideration, like these doors that now slide open rather than swinging along a hinge. A counterexample to those is the one to Gen's workshop on 233, but the way it can clip through the camera demonstrates why this may have been a consideration for those other ones. The removal of the chairs from the town overlook and the survey cave might be another indication of this. The Imager chair teleports you into place in VR. They may have wanted to minimize places where this happens. This is something I'm conflicted about because I think VR is a very worthwhile inclusion, but I don't like the idea of making compromises to the world for the sake of it. I don't know for sure if VR was the reason behind some of these changes, but if so, I'm not convinced that a working solution couldn't have been found. There's at least one other advantage to the old control style worth pointing out. Certain events needed to lock you in place while they were happening since they were largely just videos playing. This acted as a signal that something around you was happening, making you more likely to pay attention to it. Most of the time, this isn't an issue in the remake, but there are a few events that are now easy to miss. Namely, the villagers running inside when you get near for the first time, and the guy in the tower that rings the alarm. What's especially strange about the latter example is that originally this happened every time you return to Jungle Island from somewhere else, whereas, as far as I can tell, it only happens once now. I'm not sure why this change was made, considering the event is no longer disruptive to gameplay at all, and having it operate like before would at least give you a chance to notice it later if you missed it the first time. To be clear, not having control taken away from you for these types of events is a definite improvement. It's just unfortunate that what's happening can be so easily overlooked now. As a final point on this topic, these video sequences could be skipped before, which made certain activities like repeatedly rotating the gate room less annoying. This may be counterintuitive, but I actually prefer the way this works in the new version. One of Riven's strongest aspects is its sense of immersion. Several things can contribute to a feeling of immersion, but to me, the most important is that what you're thinking about as a player aligns closely with what you would be if you were actually in the game's world. In that respect, the quirks of the interface were the most immersion-breaking part of the original game, and that issue is largely done away with now. In reality, you wouldn't be able to skip the time it takes for objects to move, so having to wait means that immersion isn't disrupted. Skipping these animations and clicking around to move at inhuman speeds is just making a concession that you're playing a video game, and are more interested in completing the game than being in the world. Really, if waiting for these interactions is such a problem, that may be a sign that the mechanism's design is too cumbersome to be practical in the first place, and should be simplified. In the case of the gate room, this isn't really a problem at first, especially now that you can move between the main entrance and the cave while the room is rotating. But this can become a bit of a pain if you use the dome to get back here, especially if you want to get back to the main power room. The original layout of this area had a path from the dome directly back into the power room, as well as paths to 2 different entrances to the rotating room. Now the dome is only directly connected to one of these entrances, so there's nothing to do upon coming here this way except wait for the room to rotate. Then you need to rotate the room again from the other side in order to get back in here. The simplified layout of this space is probably a net positive, but they've oversimplified it a little to the point that it adds some inconvenience in this scenario. A separate, compounding problem here is the bridge that now collapses into the ocean, which especially comes into play in the late game. I get the feeling that this was done maybe because the developers couldn't get the other island to load seamlessly while walking across the bridge, which is pretty unfortunate. While most of the world is the same as before, there are some pretty drastic changes made in the 2024 version. I want to make it clear that any complaints I have are not just because something is different. There are quite a few very good changes. Some of these buttons that call the maglev cars were in pretty odd locations before, probably so that they didn't have to render so many animations of the car coming to you. Now these are all moved to places that make much more sense. The submarine is no longer needed to get to the school, which makes more sense than before considering the sub only seats one person. It also makes a lot of sense that you'd be blocked off from entering the village, and having both sides of the village be connected is better as well. The secret entrance to the moiety cave is great since it means they wouldn't have to all go in through the jail. The village itself has some nice added bits like Gen's podium and the Wark graveyard, and the mine behind Gen's lab is a good addition as mentioned. There are even more details added in that you may not even notice, like the decommissioned maglev tracks that used to connect Temple Island to what is now Catherine's prison. And of course, finally being able to walk around on Tay and H-233, even if only in a small area, is a fun addition that no doubt many fans will appreciate. Not all changes are clear-cut improvements, however. This room with the Imager chair has some modifications that make a lot of sense. You now have a better view of the screens and can control the door and the bridge from in the chair. That said, this room's new position is detrimental in at least a couple ways. Firstly, it enforces that you completely solve the rotating room before even having access to the next island, which shouldn't be necessary. This wasn't a problem in the original game, and having the freedom to explore more and then come back to this later was a good thing. Beyond that, this also has a ripple effect on a great moment that can happen later on if you backtrack here. Upon doing this, you might find it odd that the temple door is closed, and after it opens, you'll see an ominous image of Gen for a moment before it disappears. This still happens in the remake, but having the chair room be just a few steps away made it more likely for you to make the connection on what's going on here. By the time you come back to this place, you may not even remember how the temple door was opened in the first place. Coming across this room right after this happens serves as a reminder, demonstrating that someone was in this room, which beautifully communicates the chair's function. It's still possible to make this connection in the new version, but the amount of stuff you have to go through to get back to this room makes it much harder if this whole area isn't fresh in your mind anymore. On a more nitpicky note, it also looks like you could just drop down here from the starting area, but you can't, which breaks immersion a bit. The submarine has received some changes, the most interesting being that its in-world purpose seems to be different now. This used to be available for anyone to use, but with the town being all connected, it now looks to mainly be used for bringing wrongdoers to the gallows and the prison. This illustrates that there has been a good amount of consideration given to the ramifications of any changes, and that the developers were willing to make some alterations to the lore in order to accommodate any modifications made to the game. That said, the new starting location, combined with the fact that, for some reason, you can no longer open the Wark statue from the outside, makes it so that you can't even get into the village until you've gotten to Survey Island. Having to do a little work to get in is fine, but blocking it off until this late in the game is excessive. There isn't any crucial information in the town that the game benefits from keeping from you until later, except for the number systems, which oddly happen to be in the one place you're not restricted from entering at all. The school really should have also had a bridge that needed to be lowered like the rest of the town. That way, you'd still need the submarine to get here, but it'd also be connected to the rest of the village, keeping the best of both versions. Another curiously changed contraption is the minecart. Originally, you rode in the cart, but now there's this little platform on the end that you stand on. This makes sense in that it would allow someone to ride it while wood is in the cart, but the original gave the impression that a person wasn't supposed to ride it at all. When you arrived at the other island, it dropped you directly into the wood chipper, which was a great way of demonstrating exactly how this pipeline worked. The cart was for sending the wood over, while Gen or his people would presumably take another way around to Boiler Island. A bit inconvenient, but slow transportation was acknowledged in Gen's journal as one of the main motivations for the domes. Now you just arrive there with a safe spot to get out, and there's an added mechanism to start cutting the wood directly from within the cart. All of what's here still makes perfect sense, but I really loved the simple elegance of the way it was before. Just being dropped in like this was more exciting, looked cool, and was just an all-around very well executed moment of world building. Survey Island has undergone a few revisions, most notably the separation of access to the Wark Chamber and the back maglev station to two different elevators. While this might make some more sense geographically than before, it now feels strange to have such a fancy elevator just lead to a maglev and nothing more. It would be better if the gold elevator still went to the survey room while some other back path led to the transport point. This extra elevator command where you just punch in a combination that's told to you right outside isn't particularly interesting anyway, so the game really doesn't gain much from this change as it is. The starry expanse under the domes is the biggest addition to the world. This adds to the story in some good ways and is more interesting as a fast travel system than the way these worked before, but there are some downsides to this as well. When traveling between islands, it can be more convenient to use these than getting around the normal way, but not by much. You're always at most 2 vehicle rides away from any other island at any time, and considering there's a load time for both entering and exiting the expanse, it doesn't end up saving a ton of time in the end. Those vehicle rides are also more appealing visually, especially so considering the graphical glitches and stutters that can happen during the loading times for the domes. The newer setup also creates a bigger problem when it comes to traveling to Gen, which harms the pacing in the late game. There used to be a link to 233 from every island, but now there's only one on Temple Island. Here's a pretty likely sequence of events near the end of the game in the original. You get to Gen, but hesitate to enter the trap book the first time. You then go to Prison Island since this is the first time you can access it, speak to Catherine and then return. This time you trap Gen successfully, get the prison combination and link back to Prison Island to save Catherine. From there you link back to 233 and then back to Temple Island to finish the game. Now let's look at how a similar sequence of events would happen in the remake, and I'll even be generous and assume you won't visit Catherine without trapping Gen, since you could have visited her already in this case. You link to 233 from Temple Island. Then, hesitating to enter the book, you link back to Riven, which puts you in Gen's lab. Now, with that bridge being unusable, you have to either make 2 vehicle trips back to Temple Island, or use the dome, which also causes 2 load times. From here, you link back to 233 and trap Gen. Now you link back to the lab again, then use the dome to go to Prison Island, which is 2 more loading times. After rescuing Catherine, you take the dome back to Temple Island for 2 more. The new version takes 4 more area transitions to accomplish all this, and that's with 1 fewer visit to Prison Island. Given all the pros and cons, I'm ultimately torn on whether the Expanse is a net improvement from before, but I'd feel more positively about it if not for this added annoyance in traveling to and from H233. While the environments have some significant changes, the biggest modifications made to Riven are in the puzzles. These have all been tweaked in some way, and the results vary dramatically from worthwhile additions to major downgrades. And now it's time to talk about the control panel at the beginning. A key point here is that in the original game, the dunny numbers were never represented in order anywhere, which was deliberate. Some devices, like this window cover, had combinations you had to enter, but this was always done with some other mechanism rather than explicitly entering digits like this. This was so that you'd be most likely to learn the numbers using the hangman game in the classroom. This little game might actually be the most brilliant interactive object in all of Riven. It teaches you the numbers just as it would to the villagers, the two-player style makes it perfect as a classroom activity, and the way it's themed expresses something about the culture of the people here. So much is conveyed in just a few minutes of playing with this toy. Considering by the time you get here, you'll likely know you need to decipher these symbols. Finally finding this place and seeing it is all the more rewarding. All of these elements of the number game are still intact in the remake, but the problem is that you can now learn these numbers by just incrementing them on this panel. This can be done as soon as you power the control panel, and since you're now forced to find this cave before moving on, this isn't even that unlikely to happen. Cyan's answer to this was to create a whole other number system to learn. Now, it actually makes a lot of sense for the Rivenese to have their own system aside from the Dunny system, and this especially pays off in the moiety puzzle. But learning these numerals from a conversion sheet just isn't as interesting as the initial process using the game. I can't say for certain, but it feels to me like the developers figured a lot of people already played Riven and thus already knew these symbols, so it wouldn't matter to have them so plainly in order here. This sort of mindset of catering to existing fans is honestly the impression I get from a lot of the changes made to the puzzles, but I think that's a mistake. This remake is going to be a lot of people's first experience of Riven, so I really think they should have designed everything with new players in mind first. The animal puzzle has been entirely revamped with only the method of entering the solution carrying over. There are several aspects to the new puzzle that are great, like the cemeteries, the moths, the Rivenese numbers, and the rotational component as an extra layer of encryption. The Rebel lens is at least a neat idea, and the use of the invisible paint makes a lot of sense, especially considering the moiety are trying to keep this solution secret from Gen and his followers, though I'm not sure why they'd just leave the lens out in the open like this for anyone to take. I think it would have been better to have the lens be found in the linking cave, though this would require the dark passage to be handled differently. That aside, the addition of the lens has some other downsides. One issue is that once you find this thing, there's a temptation to want to walk around everywhere while looking through it so that you don't miss anything, which can really get in the way of just soaking in your surroundings. Frankly, the lens of truth mechanic isn't a particularly novel gameplay concept in 2024. I don't think its inclusion was worth it, not just for how disruptive it can be to enjoying the atmosphere, but also because of how it changes the puzzle itself. What was, and I'd argue still is, novel was the way you learned the correct symbols in the original game. The interesting part of this puzzle wasn't matching up a bunch of symbols. There are dozens of other games where you do essentially this exact same thing. What was great about this puzzle was the way it required you to learn about the animals themselves, and make the connection to the symbol from there. I like the addition of the mine, but what I don't like about this is that they removed the E-tram trap from here. Sure, you can still see it in the lab, but originally you had to figure out what this contraption was on your own and set it yourself. Upon catching the creature, you'd notice that it makes a familiar sound. This was one of my favorite moments in the entire game. The way you obtained this information not only took a little more effort before, but was incredibly organic, like you just discovered something about the world and are now applying that knowledge for this code. This was also one of the things that made calling the Wark such a great discovery, since that was the moment you could match its sound up to its silhouette. Now you just see the symbol right here, making the moment in the survey room feel less meaningful. Many first-time players of the remake probably won't even understand what at least a few of these symbols represent, since just showing you the symbol in the clue removes that extra step of having to engage with the animal directly. One of the clues in the 1997 version did have a similar issue, but the gap was filled by having to find the orb in the lab and examine Gen's note. The new version keeps this superficially, but it also misses the mark on what made this significant in the first place. The main way that this contributed to the puzzle was that the orb was found in a place you can't get to, so you had to find where Gen saw it and view it from there in order to see the clue. In the remake, the totem is in a place you can go to at any time, and you can see the symbol while you're there. The only missing piece of information is the number, which could be deduced by process of elimination. This means you wouldn't even need to notice this in the lab anymore in order to solve this piece of the puzzle. As I mentioned earlier, I do enjoy some of the other additions to this puzzle, and I think those add to the world in a significant way, but they didn't have to sacrifice the real essence of the original puzzle to make those gains. The cemetery totems, new number system, and rotational encryption could all have been added while just having something nearby generate the sound similar to how it was before. Even if they didn't want to rely on sound for some reason, they could have at least had the clue point you to the animal itself in some way rather than just showing you the symbol. Combining the best of both would have made this a definite improvement from before, but instead it loses arguably the most important piece. Before moving on, a couple more points of contention. It's not clear how the moiety managed to get these moths to gather in this exact formation. It's also questionable to me why they would build one of these hint totems on the prison island. My best explanation for why the bridge to here is extended already is that someone from the moiety has been breaking in from the other side and extending it somehow. But this still seems like a bit of an unreasonable way to communicate their code as opposed to just having all the hints located on the village island like before. Riven's most infamously difficult puzzle has now been toned down, but Cyan has overcompensated to the point of turning this into a joke. To start off, some aspects I like. The added lore of how these marbles are mined, charged, and sent to the power dome is cool, and it's nice that this process is conveyed by allowing you to perform these steps firsthand. The detail about why these are different colors is neat, and the experiment in the lab to determine the base strike value is a nice touch. I also like the use of these windows to associate each dome with its color symbol. I prefer this to the way they were marked before, though it's undermined a little by also having them marked with the moiety paint. Unfortunately though, beyond that, the puzzle is underwhelming in quite a few ways. Instead of having to examine the topography of the islands closely to locate the domes, now the correct coordinates are just shown to you after doing this painfully basic slider puzzle. Similar to my complaint about the moiety puzzle, many players probably won't even understand that these 5 points are the dome locations, whereas before you needed to make that connection yourself. The mapping system itself is completely redesigned and the new version is lacking in comparison. It's been simplified to the point of being impractical both for your usage and its in-world purpose, due to the lower level of detail and how far away the images are from you. It's a bit ironic to me that given the increase in technology since 1997, the amount of detail in these island maps has decreased so much, but I digress. In exchange for the better mapping device, we get an extra bit of lore regarding these wark totems, but this seems redundant with the gallows, so I don't think the trade was worth it. The numerical component is an attempt to add some complexity to the puzzle, but there's a huge problem with the way this is implemented. The method used to enter this combination is reminiscent of the domes in the original version, but in this context, it completely undermines the color aspect. Ideally, players are supposed to learn the colors associated with these symbols by using the lights in the survey cave, but because the colors are in a fixed order on the slider here, you could easily determine which color corresponds with which symbol simply from the order of their values on Gen's note. From there, which color marble should go in which position is trivial to figure out. This might not seem like much of an issue on its own, but combined with the changes to the animal puzzle, this effectively means you could finish the entire game on a first playthrough without ever even visiting this room. Considering just how much information is revealed here, I consider this to be one of the most important locations in the game. Even with my opinion aside, it's undoubtedly one of the game's most iconic areas, so it's a shame just how much weight can be removed from getting here in the remake. While this numerical code tries to add to the puzzle, it ends up actually making the rest of the puzzle easier because of this botched handling of the code entry. So now the 2024 version is 2 for 2 on messing up number entry devices. Some people have criticized the original puzzle for being unfair, particularly because there were 6 marbles and it was impossible to know which color represents Prison Island. If Riven were strictly a puzzle game, this lack of complete information would be pretty bad, but I'd like to offer a defense. As mentioned earlier, I believe that immersion is one of Riven's greatest strengths. To this end, the puzzles are designed so that they feel integrated into the world rather than something arbitrarily set up by a game designer. This has been repeatedly stated by the Miller brothers as a major focus going back to the making of Myst. One tool used to achieve this was to have some pieces not quite fit perfectly into place. The moiety clue in Gen's lab is a great example. This encourages you to think about the people here, their conflicts, and events that have happened, which is exactly the kind of strategy you'd be using if you were actually on the islands. Here's a counterintuitive idea you may not have considered. Game design patterns can be immersion breaking. Solving a puzzle by recognizing that it follows a common format and using designer logic is something you can only do in the context of a game. So this type of problem solving pulls you out of the world. In reality, mysteries don't tend to have airtight solutions. Having a little bit of missing information like this actually helps to sell the situation even better, because someone trying to keep you out of somewhere wouldn't be leaving breadcrumbs around for you to solve in a perfectly logical manner. The marble puzzle forgoes a little bit of so-called good game design for the sake of enhancing immersion. If what I'm saying sounds like a stretch, then it's worth keeping in mind that Riven often gets high praise for how its puzzles don't feel like puzzles, that they feel more like obstacles that just naturally exist in a believable world. I agree with this praise, but it's with the exact same reasoning that I commend the game for that I'm defending this design. Now, you could argue that this could be used as an excuse to justify any bad puzzle design, but an important point is that this doesn't make the puzzle completely unsolvable or anything. Assuming you've solved it conceptually, it should only take a few tries before landing on the correct combination. People often get too caught up in evaluating games based on accepted good practices, but it's important to recognize that sometimes going against the grain a little in some ways can pay off in other areas. A common theme in my disappointments with the puzzles in the remake is that they don't require you to learn as much about the world of Riven. You no longer have to notice the animals since the symbols are shown to you directly, you no longer have to examine the topography and find the dome coordinates, and the process of learning other elements like the dunny numbers and the colors can be ruined a bit by some strange design choices. All of this results in an overall shallower level of engagement with the world needed to complete the game, which feels like a significant downgrade considering just how much of the game is focused on experiencing its world. The thing is, the details themselves are all still intact. You can still see the E-tram in the trap, you can still call the wark, you can still sneak up on the sunners, you can still look through the cameras and mess with the colored lights, you can still play around with the number game, and so on. All of this is still there in the 2024 version, and you could argue that that's what's most important. And honestly, there's a part of me that agrees with that sentiment. But the original game had a synergy between the puzzles and all of the rest of its components. The environments, creatures, story, and everything else that is unmatched by any other adventure game I've played. And it's disappointing that the new version doesn't measure up in this area due to these changes. There are unfortunately enough downsides to the remake that I don't consider it to be the definitive version of Riven, and I hope people don't see it as a replacement for the original game. I'd like to encourage anyone interested to play the original version if you can. Even if you've already played the remake and watched this entire video, it's still worth playing. As of right now, Cyan still keeps the older versions of the Myst games available for purchase, which shouldn't be taken for granted considering the way some other companies treat remakes and their classic libraries. There are so many things to appreciate that I didn't even mention here, and what they were able to achieve all the way back in 1997 is pretty incredible. Here's just a few examples. For those live-action cutscenes, a huge amount of effort went into making the lighting and camera angles match up with the environments so that they blend together well. Notice how the lighting across Catherine changes twice in this scene. Once when the elevator reaches the bottom, and once when the door opens behind you, letting in the sunlight.
We had to build this huge contraption that rotated at just the same radius that the maglev would rotate, and the lights had to match so that the lighting on the scribe had to match what you would expect.
Action, go. 1001, 1002, 1003, 1004, 1005. Cut.
It ended up being, from our point of view, a very spectacular effect. Hopefully, from the player's point of view, it just looked real.
Objectives could be completed in any order, so the cutscenes have different variations depending on what you've done already. There are multiple bad endings, including several different outcomes for using the trap book in different places and situations. Sequences like catching the E-tram and calling the wark have numerous variations for repeated interactions. The mapping device has animations for raising, lowering, and rotating all 25 of its sections. It's amazing that contraptions like this, the submarine, and the gate room even made it into the final game, considering just how much of a pain they would have been to implement.
It was a nightmare. It was just a nightmare. Because we kept thinking we had all the states done. We kept thinking everything was done for the gate room. We'd send all this stuff upstairs and, they would put it together and it's like, well, no, we're missing these 28 shots or, just endless amounts.
Of course, a lot of this stuff isn't really a big deal in the newer engine, but given the limitations they were working with all those years ago, Cyan really went above and beyond making this world as rich and detailed as possible. They've done an excellent job realizing the world for the remake, but it also sometimes feels like an uncanny alternate universe version of the world I fell in love with. There are some genuine improvements, but at the end of the day, I would have preferred a remake that errs a bit more on the side of staying faithful to the original. Hopefully, I haven't given the impression that Riven 2024 is bad. I have made some harsh criticisms, but it's only because Riven was such a masterpiece already that I hold this new version to such a high standard. As far as adventure games go, the new Riven is still better than most of what's out there, so it's very much worth playing. I also don't want to insinuate that Cyan has since forgotten what made the original game so great. If there's one area where they've gotten worse over the years, it's with the overabundance of navigational puzzles, which can make the game start to feel more like unraveling a huge Zelda dungeon than exploring a world at times. One of my biggest concerns going into the Riven remake was that it would fall into this, but it doesn't. There's no superfluous lock and key mechanisms added in. The only significant addition in this department is getting into the town. Abduction and Firmament both have plenty of issues of their own, but they still largely capture that extremely dense world building that has become the defining characteristic of Cyan's games. The same holds true for the new Riven, even if it misses the mark on some of the details. Ever since I played Riven, I've been starved for more similar experiences, and no other games have really been able to satisfy this than Cyan's own. They occupy a niche that very few other developers are even attempting to fill, so it's great to see them still going with such high quality. There are some areas where the remake disappoints. In particular, there should have been more consideration given to the puzzles. But on the other hand, the Fifth Age has been masterfully recreated, refined, and infused with even more detail than before. Cyan's philosophy has long been to craft interesting worlds as the top priority, so with the admirable job they've done in bringing the islands to life, I'd say they accomplished their most important goal. Beyond that, the original version can still be played. Thankfully, unlike Riven itself, it hasn't collapsed into the fissure just yet.